Hello and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Sarah Koh, and you're watching the first session of our three-part series on US-Cuba relations. And today our guest is Professor Nick Cullather. Now, Professor Cullather earned his PhD from the University of Virginia and currently serves as the Executive Associate Dean of Indiana University's School of Global and International Studies and is also the co-editor of the journal Diplomatic History. Now, as a historian of U.S. foreign relations, he specifically focuses his research on intelligence, development, and nation building. He's also the author of The Hungry World, America's Cold War Battle Against Poverty in Asia, which was awarded the Hawley Prize for Economic History and the Robert Farrell Prize in Diplomatic History. Now, as the U.S. and Cuba continue on their path of economic and diplomatic restoration, today Professor Cullather will give us his insights on the histories of the two countries' relations and what implications these could have as they work towards cooperation and partnership. Dr. Cullather, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome, Sarah. Happy to be here.
So maybe you can give us a quick overview of U.S. and Cuba's diplomatic and economic background and leading up to the current revamped situation.
I guess in a nutshell, Cuba is the place where Americans go to misbehave. In the 18th century, it was a haven for smugglers and pirates and other lawbreakers. In the 19th century, several Americans tried to take over Cuba, the so-called filibusterers who went down and formed little armies and tried to take the Spanish colony either to create their own independent kingdom or to unite it with the United States. After the abolition of slavery in the United States, it became a place where former Confederates could go to reestablish their old lifestyle as slave owners. And a lot of Cuba's sugar lands became owned by Americans and later by New York financial interests. In the 20th century, of course, it was the place where people went to get away from prohibition. When liquor was illegal in the United States, it was plentiful in Havana. And Pan Am had daily flights going from New York to Havana where Americans could go down, have liquor, dance, gamble, and come back the following day by plane and never miss a work day. And of course, nowadays, it's the place where the U.S. Army goes in Guantanamo Bay to do things that would be illegal if they were doing them back here in the United States. So Cuba has had a lot of purposes for the United States. It's close, it's a big island, and it's a place where Americans go to be someplace other than the United States.
Well, certainly the U.S. and Cuba has a long and, in many ways, very complicated history. So, staying on this topic of bilateral relations, so the U.S. lifting sanctions on Cuba, as well as the two countries really reopening the official diplomatic channel, has definitely been a big topic this year. And I think that's probably why a lot of U.S. institutions and U.S. businesses are really gearing up and looking forward to developing new networks there and new, hopefully, corporations, if not entrepreneurial motives there. So with that being said, what kind of opportunities do you think lie for both U.S. and Cuba in their public and private sectors when it comes to cooperation?
Well, the changes won't come fast, but there'll be a slow and gradual buildup of trade and commercial relations between the United States and Cuba. There already is actually considerable trade. The embargo isn't a complete embargo, it's a selective embargo. And it's a one-way embargo. Americans can't buy anything from Cuba, but Cubans can buy American farm goods. And something like $300 million in American farm goods are sold right now, every year in Cuba. So that's going to be the leading sector. We can take a look at Cuba's larger economy, what they sell to other people. Their principal trading partners are China, Canada, Spain, and Latin American countries. They sell agricultural goods. Sugar is still a major export product of Cuba. But they also sell oil, a little bit of oil, and that could come to the United States potentially through wider trade relations. And they sell medical supplies and goods as well. Cuba has a quite sophisticated and advanced medical establishment, and they manufacture pharmaceuticals, and they also manufacture medical equipment and procedures of various kinds. So those could be potential business opportunities for Americans.
Now, I guess a follow-up question, on the flip side of opportunities, I'm sure there are some hurdles that both sides could possibly face. Now, what do you think some of these difficulties or hurdles might be?
Yeah, so the first one is political. There's likely to be continuing opposition in Congress to greater trade with Cuba. What President Obama is likely to do, though, is to kind of chip away around the edges to create enough of a momentum for growing trade that it's going to be inexorable. I think it's going to be difficult, perhaps impossible, for the next president, should the next president be Republican, to reverse it. So Cuba's trade is likely to grow. We can take a look at the past and see other examples where embargoes have come off and see what kinds of problems crop up. Vietnam, for instance, was under a 20-year-long embargo from the United States after the end of the Vietnam War. It was lifted 20 years ago. Trade grew very slowly at first, but eventually, because Vietnam had a low-wage labor force, it became attractive for American manufacturers who were able to move there to invest capital, to build textile manufacturing plants. And so you began to have considerably more trade. It was really only when Vietnam joined the trade organizations, the World Trade Organization, and more recently the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that they came into kind of full relationship with the United States. So we can expect a similar kind of ramping up with Cuba.
And I think you echoed this point as well, but there are pundits who caution that there's still much to be done for US-Cuba relations to really get up to its potential, positive potential. So I guess looking back in history and regarding them as lesson learned per se, what do you think the two countries can do this time around that could really change the situations for the best?
So taking that Vietnam example, one thing that needs to be done is to make sure that that Cuba would join international organizations in a way that helps make them open to all world trade and not just to U.S. trade. That would facilitate more trade relationships. It will also be the case, as it was in Vietnam, that this is a one-party state with a very low-wage labor force. That can be very attractive to Americans, but it can also create potential for exploitation. And so Americans will have to be very cautious about that. In the Vietnam case, there were actually anti-dumping statutes that were enacted in the United States to prevent American companies from exploiting Vietnam when that was a real possibility. So the one big difference from that historical example will, of course, be tourism, which in Cuba we can expect to be considerable, but which right now is restrained still by restrictions on the travel of Americans. If those travel restrictions come off, that will have a powerful transformative effect on both countries.
And wrapping things up, moving forward, what do you think the U.S. institutions as well as U.S. entrepreneurs could do in order to really successfully enter and leave positive impacts in Cuba, not only the economy sector, but society as a whole?
Learn Spanish, first of all. Entrepreneurs should think about doing that. Don't expect much. Initially, trade will be quite small. The winners here are not going to be the first ones in. They're going to be the ones who go in later and smarter. And they're going to be the ones who capture a large part of the Cuban market. There's a lot of people down there who live in Cuba. And as their economy grows, as buying power increases in Cuba, that could become a significant market for the United States.
Well, Professor Cullather, thank you so much for coming in to speak with us today.
You're welcome.
And that's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. Thank you for tuning in. Now join us again next time on part 2 of US-Cuba relations. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, @indiana.edu.